The desperate trio came upon the car, parked exactly where it always was. The orange-red sheen of the small vehicle almost seemed to flicker and glow like the dull flame of a dying fire, captured in the misty disorientation of the thick, sticky spring night. Just beyond the pavement, across a small patch of poorly manicured grass, a dark void lay behind the towering windows of the apartment building, with no hint of light within. Together, the three approached the windows and peered into the darkness, able to make out only the edges and shapes of objects, as they captured faint reflections emanating from the dusky bulbs atop the few functioning light poles in the parking lot. Shining a flashlight into the darkened apartment, they watched with hesitation as the beam moved along the back wall, sliding down onto the arm of the couch, dipping down into the obscured ocean of the carpet. There, the flashlight captured an out-of-place object in its refracted glow. They quickly identified it as Janet's purse, but they could not determine just where the 29-year-old was herself. Deploying a key acquired from the manager's office, the three swung open the door and stepped softly into the blackness. Lost fingers slid along the wall in pursuit of light switches, who responded to contact by snapping up into their powered-on positions, but there came no illumination. It was then that their breath caught in their throats as the pale glow of the flashlight delved deeper into the apartment. Across from the door, the light came to rest on what appeared to be the bloody print of a woman's hand, smeared onto the wall just outside of Janet's bedroom. Stepping further inside, the flashlight moved from left to right, examining the floor and walls of the hall until the beam passed through an open doorway. It was there that the brutal scene was discovered. Lying on the cold tile floor in a bloody heap was the body of Janet Shirar, and it was immediately clear that she was dead. Blood, now coagulating, had pooled around the body, which lay face down, the crown of her head towards the door. The bloody scene spanned multiple rooms, telling the horrifying story of Janet's last moments. The attack initiated in the bedroom before the 29-year-old tried to escape her killer, fleeing towards the bathroom, the only other room with a door that could be locked, but by then, it was already too late. She was losing blood fast from the surprise attack, which appeared to have roused her from her sleep. By the time she made it into the bathroom in desperate pursuit of some measure of protection, her body had already begun to weaken as she grew woozy with blood loss. It was there, on the bathroom floor, that her killer brutally lashed out, stabbing and slashing at her back, neck, and legs. The fact that Janet had already expired neither slowed nor stopped the assailant, who was thought to have been fully enveloped in some kind of homicidal frenzy. Somehow, despite the proximity of other tenants in the small apartment complex, Janet had been brutally murdered, and no one had heard a sound or saw a thing. The killer vanished into that sticky night without leaving behind a clue, not so much as a hair. It was as though some vengeful spirit had come in the night to wreak havoc, but why target the beloved special education teacher? That is a question among many, which remains unanswered more than 40 years later. This is Trace Evidence, episode 250, The Murder of Janet Shirar. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. In today's episode, we delve into a horrifying unsolved crime out of Indiana, where in 1980, 29-year-old special education teacher Janet Shirar was brutally murdered in her Kokomo apartment. More than 45 years later, and this case remains unsolved. This is episode 250, The Murder of Janet Shirar. Janet Rose Shirar was born on Saturday, March 10, 1951 in Kokomo, Indiana, to parents Richard and Rose. Janet was the third of three children born to the Shirars, having both a brother, Steve, and a sister, Kathy. Janet was raised in central Howard County, 60 miles east of Delphi in neighboring Carroll County, in the small city of Marion. Friends and family described her as a smart and insightful young woman with a compassionate heart and an innate desire to help and assist others. Janet was fun-loving with a warm and welcoming personality, but as friends could attest to, she had a tendency to keep a lot of people at arm's length, letting in only a select few over the years. As one friend, Jan Hinkle, would later note, Janet was polite and kind, but she didn't hesitate to speak her mind. Hinkle explained, saying, quote, "Janet wasn't hard to know, but if she didn't like you, she wouldn't give you the time of day. She wouldn't cut you out. She just didn't acknowledge you. You knew where you stood with Janet." However, if you were someone that Janet invited into her inner circle and personal life, you were set. She was a dedicated mate who stood up for her friends even in times where they weren't strong enough to stand up for themselves. Fearless, passionate, and unwavering, Janet never made a friend she wouldn't consider a lifelong associate. Aside from being a friendly and caring young woman, Janet was also highly intelligent and keenly focused on her academic goals and achievements. She was a voracious reader who dove deep into any book she got her hands on. She attended Sweetser Elementary School, where she consistently was a member of the honor roll. In 1964, she began attending Oak Hill High School, located in the town of Converse, some 20 miles east of Kokomo. There, Janet really blossomed, taking on new challenges and conquering them with a zest and desire for higher hills to climb. As a teen, she was heavily involved in extracurricular activities and belonged to a wide array of both academic and social clubs, as well as student government. In her freshman year, she successfully tried out for the cheer squad, and by her senior year, she was co-captain. Throughout the pages of her senior yearbook, there are dozens of photos of Janet, laughing with friends, dancing in the hallways, cheering at ball games, and attending different groups and gatherings. She graduated from Oak Hill in 1969 at the age of 18 and immediately proceeded to college, attending Indiana University at Kokomo. Much as had been the case in high school, she was heavily involved in different groups and organizations while maintaining a high grade point average. Professors sang her praises and her classmates followed suit, ultimately electing Janet to be student body president, where she was later celebrated as being instrumental in creating a student foundation at the regional campus. While in university, Janet would truly reveal herself to be a polymath as her interests and attention were spread across several different subjects. She entered her senior year in 1972, and during the next 2 semesters, she majored in political science and psychology. Simultaneously, the 22-year-old earned her teaching certificate while working at Kokomo's Hawthorne High School. Graduating in the spring of '73, Janet showed no signs of slowing down as she sunk her teeth into her first real job, accepting a position as a psychiatric attendant at the then Regional Mental Health Center. Janet thoroughly enjoyed the job, with her mother, Rose, later noting that she was thrilled because, quote, she was challenged and somebody needed her. A year later, in 1974, Janet accepted an offer to teach history and social studies at East Aurora High School in Aurora, Illinois, 200 miles from the only home she'd ever known. While teaching was a career which captured her fully, body and soul, she soon became disenfranchised by the bureaucracy of school and what one friend described as the petty politics that came with her new position. Not only was the job not quite what she had imagined, this was also a difficult time in her personal life as her parents, Richard and Rose, filed for divorce. Perhaps, a friend later speculated, that could be a reason she chose to take a teaching job so far away, but it wasn't something Janet would ever admit to, if indeed it were true. She returned to Kokomo in 1976 and quickly picked up a completely different job, this time as a marketing specialist at Universal Steel Incorporated. Then located at 990 East Carter Street in downtown Kokomo, today the home of OmniSource LLC, there isn't much of an answer as to what led Janet to this job, other than it allowed her to come home and do something entirely different, in essence, to cleanse her palate of the bad taste Aurora had left. This same year, Janet decided to head back to the University of Indiana at Kokomo, where she took on postgraduate courses for 2 semesters. 2 years later, in 1978, she left U.S. Steel and once again changed careers, being hired on as a sales representative with the Prudential Insurance Company of America. Although it was a good job with a solid salary, it was a little too comfortable for a woman who both loved and, to a degree, needed the pressure and urgency of a challenge. Whether it was reaping the rewards delivered by hard work and dedication, or just the hand of fate deciding to take a role, Janet was offered a teaching position that truly excited her. The bitterness of her initial teaching experience in Aurora had faded out enough that she jumped at the new position, becoming a special education teacher at Bon Air Middle School, located on North Apperson Way in north-central Kokomo. Janet was taking on a very new challenge, but one for which she was highly trained, as her teaching assignment would see her instructing emotionally disabled students between the ages of 12 and 15. For someone who loved to teach and had a strong desire to help others, this seemed to be a perfect fit. Janet took it seriously, and from the moment she accepted the position, she began developing a curriculum and designing a new and focused approach to instruction. Her mother would later comment about her need to help others, telling the Kokomo Tribune, quote, "Janet was a person that people came to with their problems. She took psychology and she used it in many ways. She was always trying to solve people's problems and give advice. She had it whether they wanted it or not." Not long after accepting the new job, Janet moved into apartment number 11 at the Center Meadow Apartments, then located along South Hardbeck Road, approximately 6 miles southeast of Bon Air Middle School. Janet began teaching at the school in the fall of 1979, and according to friends and coworkers, she absolutely loved her job. Specifically, she developed a tight bond with her students. According to friends, Janet began developing her new social circle at the school, befriending many other teachers and faculty members. She enjoyed spending time with her friends, chatting over drinks at local pubs, and while she dated a little bit, her job and her students always came first. According to one man who had dated Janet for a short period of time, it was very usual and almost typical for her to cancel dates and social events to instead work on lesson plans and grading papers. Almost everyone who knew Janet has gone on to describe her, in one way or another, as very physically attractive with an alluring smile. It's been said that, most of the time, she was so involved in her own thoughts and plans that she didn't notice the men who lined up to throw their hats into the ring, and on the rare occasions when she did, they didn't quite live up to what she was seeking. She wanted to find someone to share her life with, to settle down and begin a family, but she wasn't willing to sacrifice her career or her goals, let alone to slow down enough for someone to fully catch up. There would be time later, she noted, tragically unaware of how little time she had left. Friends said she filled much of her free time reading about new and different teaching methods, seeking out what would best serve her class. Elaine Langford, who worked as an aide at Bon Air, got to know Janet well and described her as both friendly and somewhat closed off, saying, quote, "She knew everybody. She was not a very uptight person. She did what she wanted to do, but she was a very closed person who wouldn't let anybody get close to her." As her first year of teaching at Bon Air came to a close in the spring of 1980, Janet was 29 years old with her whole life ahead of her. As was customary for the young brunette, she wasn't planning on taking her summer off, laying by the pool and taking it easy. She wanted challenges, and she set goals. She was determined to assist her stepfather, Alvin, by driving a dump truck around the site of the family's new home being built in neighboring Carroll County. Alvin had recently taught her how to handle big trucks, and she couldn't wait to show him what she could do. Initially, when Alvin and Rose got together, Janet wasn't quick to accept her new stepfather, but over the years they grew very close, with Alvin later saying, quote, "If she'd been my own daughter, I couldn't love her anymore. She was over here almost every day." According to friends, She had a lot of other plans as well. She wanted to cut her hair short, drop her cigarette habit, return to school in pursuit of her master's degree, and she was planning to start a diet. All of her friends were quick to note that she was extremely athletic and in great shape. A diet was unnecessary, but once she'd made up her mind about something, there was no changing it. As one friend later jokingly noted, quote, "You couldn't tell her anything." Always very upfront and opinionated, as she reached the end of her 20s, Janet was more willing to offer up advice than she was to accept it. However, the bright, loving, and inspiring teacher who moved heaven and earth to support her students to the best of her ability would sadly never make it out of her 20s. The school year was nearly complete, and Janet locked in plans for how she'd keep busy over the summer before beginning her second year at Bon Air. Friday, May 25th, 1980, marked the beginning of a busy Memorial Day weekend for the 29-year-old. As had become family tradition, Memorial Day weekend always involved a large picnic, which doubled as somewhat of a family reunion, and it was also when they would celebrate her nephew's birthday. According to co-worker Jan Hinkle, Janet was last seen alive at approximately 4:30 p.m. that afternoon. As the two women were leaving school grounds to begin their weekend, Hinkle was looking to share the good news. She had just been offered a full-time special education contract at the school, and she invited Janet out for a few drinks to celebrate. But Janet declined, noting that she needed to pick up a cake for her nephew's birthday as well as the present. The two said their goodbyes and agreed to catch up at the beginning of the week. Neither realized that this would be the last time they would ever speak. Janet's movements throughout the early evening have never been reported, if indeed they are known, but police confirm that she arrived safely to her apartment within 2 hours of leaving work. Her mother, Rose, called the apartment twice that night and chatted with her daughter. The two discussed the purchase of the birthday cake as well as the present they had gotten, a pair of boxing gloves for the nephew who was turning 12. According to Rose, her daughter was in good spirits during their discussions and expressed no concerns or worries about anything. Their conversation was completely normal, and Rose had no reason to believe anything could be wrong. The final time anyone spoke with Janet occurred at approximately midnight when an unnamed friend called to talk for just a few minutes. This is the last time anyone was able to confirm that Janet was alive. Saturday quickly came and went without anyone hearing from or seeing Janet. Despite multiple calls placed to the apartment, there was no answer. She was supposed to get together with her family, and when she didn't show up, they couldn't figure out why. On the one hand, it was very unlike Janet to miss the gathering, but on the other, it wasn't entirely impossible that she'd gotten caught up in something work-related and lost track of time. She had that kind of dedication to her job. However, by Sunday night, the family had grown very concerned. Once again, dozens of calls to the apartment went unanswered, and finally, her mother and stepfather decided they needed to go and check for themselves. Not in possession of a key before leaving, Rose picked up the phone and contacted a male friend of Janet's and asked him to get a pass key from the apartment manager to meet them there. The 15-minute drive heading southeast of Kokomo seemed to stretch on for hours as Rose and Alvin alternated between different benign scenarios that could explain away Janet's absence and the aching silence that suggested the possibility of something far worse. Rose hoped for the former, but she couldn't deny a growing knot in her stomach, which made her fearful of the latter. Arriving at the small complex, Janet's parents met up with the friend and got a copy of the key. This friend of Janet's, out of fear, requested that his identity not be shared, and to this day, more than 40 years later, it never has been. Arriving at the building, the three quickly identified Janet's car, a red-orange Datsun B210, parked in her normal spot not far from the main entrance. While at first glance, everything with the car appeared to be normal, the group of three soon discovered that while the vehicle was locked, the driver's side door was slightly ajar. It was very unlike Janet to leave the vehicle unsecured in that way, especially considering her apartment was not in the greatest part of town. There had been, in previous months, several attempted break-ins, and all of the tenants were very safety conscious. Approaching the building, the three cupped their hands around their faces as they peered through the windows into the foreboding darkness of the apartment, though they couldn't make out much of anything. Pulling out a flashlight, Rose shined it through the glass and began moving it around the room, illuminating small sections of the living room inch by inch. At one point, the beam stopped when Rose spotted her daughter's purse, sitting in the middle of the living room floor, hanging open and appearing somewhat disheveled. The three quickly proceeded on to the front door where the unidentified friend tried the knob, finding it locked, before sliding the key in. As the tumblers clicked into place, the door swung open and all three stood in the dim light of the parking lot staring into the darkened apartment. The friend, familiar with the layout of this one-bedroom unit, swung his hand up to the light switches and clicked them on, but nothing happened, and that was enough to give him pause, as he'd later tell the Tribune, quote, "The lights didn't come on. That sent shivers up me." A few steps into the apartment, the friend felt his foot catch on some fabric. Reaching down, he picked up what appeared to be a faded yellow towel smeared with blood. Freaked out, he dropped it onto the couch and proceeded deeper into the living room with Rose and Alvin trailing behind. Moving the flashlight around, he soon discovered some out-of-place items. Janet's telephone normally sat on an old whiskey barrel butted up against the side of the couch, across from the doors to the bedroom and bathroom. Now, however, the phone was on the other side of the room, far from the bedroom and bathroom, with its line pulled taut. The friend thought to himself that it appeared someone wanted to make a call and didn't want anyone in the bedroom or bathroom to be able to hear the conversation. Either that, or perhaps someone had moved it as far away as possible to make it difficult to reach the phone in a timely manner. Moving around the couch and avoiding the phone line, he lifted up the flashlight and cast the beam towards the bedroom and bathroom doors. There, on a wall besides the bedroom door, was a partially dried, bloody handprint that appeared to have come from a woman's left hand. A second bloody partial handprint would later be discovered by police officers examining the scene. That second print was located on a wall near the kitchen, approximately waist-high off the floor. It was theorized that this print was left behind accidentally by the killer during an attempt to clean up the grisly scene. The three moved deeper into the apartment, heading towards the bedroom door beside the bloody handprint, but the friend leading the group had his attention captured by the open bathroom door, and as he approached the threshold, the flashlight pierced the darkness and unveiled a hideously gruesome sight. Janet's nude, lifeless body lying face down on the bathroom floor. The top of Janet's head was facing towards the door, her feet to the window. Her face was pointed straight down at the cold tile floor, and her arms were perfectly straight down along her sides as though she were lying at attention. Oddly, the friend noticed, while her arms were straight, her hands were rotated, palms up towards the ceiling, and it appeared that her hands had been wiped clean. It seemed clear that Janet had been placed into that position as there was nothing natural about it. Just a few inches from the body lie the presumed murder weapon, a 4-inch-long Steelite brand paring knife which had previously belonged to Janet's grandmother. The friend didn't go any deeper into the bathroom as it was very apparent that Janet was deceased. Quickly looking over the horrible sight, the flashlight moved up and down Janet's body, revealing multiple slash and stab wounds across her back and the backs of her legs. Alvin stepped into the room next and gasped, quickly turning and ushering Rose out of the apartment before she could see what had been done to her daughter. Closing the door behind them, the friend rushed to the apartment across the hall and banged on the door, calling for the tenant to get an ambulance and the police. It was just after 11 p.m. when the call came into the switchboard at the Howard County Sheriff's Department, and multiple units were dispatched to the Center Meadow Apartments, just outside of the Kokomo Police Department's jurisdiction. Arriving at the complex, investigators entered the apartment and quickly began making notes of their observations. In the bathroom, where Janet's body was found, they described a horrifying scene that was so vicious and brutal, one investigator referred to the murder as a hate killing. Police noted more than a dozen stab wounds and slashes in Janet's back, torso, thighs, and even her head. Exploring more of the apartment, police entered the victim's bedroom where they found evidence indicating that that was likely the room in which the attack had begun. There was a thick spray of blood jutting across the dresser and mirror, what appeared to the officers to have been the result of a major vein or artery being severed. While Janet was nude when her body was found, police discovered her clothes that she had been wearing before the attack folded neatly and stacked in her closet, which stood out to them as strange and out of place. It was theorized at the time that Janet, nude and in bed, had been surprised by the attack and fled to the bathroom in an attempt to escape the killer, but the blood loss had been so extensive that she was already growing faint by the time she got there. After a thorough sweep through the apartment, Janet's body was removed to the coroner's office where an autopsy was scheduled for the following morning. Fingerprints were located and removed from multiple items in the apartment in hopes that they might lead to the killer's identity, but according to investigators, they didn't have a lot to work with in regard to what may or may not belong to the killer. They didn't really find anything inside the apartment that didn't appear to belong there. At the same time, they didn't note anything which should have been there and was now missing. In fact, despite a thorough examination of the scene, they could find no sign of a robbery and no real indication of a struggle. Instead, it appeared that someone within the apartment had attacked Janet without warning, and there wasn't time for the 29-year-old to do more than try and escape. Looking over the front door and the windows, police found no evidence of forced entry, and were left to presume that Janet either didn't lock her door, something which seemed unlikely, or perhaps that she knew the killer and had let him into the apartment. Whether or not the murder was premeditated or came as the result of some kind of clash between the two, no one could say for sure at that time. The following day, Monday, May 26th, Deputy Coroner John Cardwell began the autopsy while investigators returned to the complex. At the time, Center Meadows was a 32-unit low-cost apartment building. Investigators believed that, given the thin walls and multiple neighbors within close proximity, that they had a good chance someone had heard or seen something the night of the crime. They began canvassing, but kept running into dead ends as they couldn't find any tenant who had seen or heard anything. Surely, they imagined, Janet must have screamed out at least during the beginning of the attack, but if she had, no one had heard it. Ultimately, detectives managed to find only one neighbor who had anything to report. According to the sole witness, around 3:30 in the morning on Sunday, nearly 20 hours before the body was found, this person heard what they thought to be a woman's scream, followed by the sound of a car door closing and a small engine starting up and driving away. The witness did not get out of bed to see what the vehicle was, nor who was driving. While this helped establish a possible ending time for the crime, it did little to assist the main investigation. Back at the office of the coroner, John Cardwell completed the autopsy and was able to make several different determinations. He determined that the first stab had been the fatal blow, penetrating Janet's back and severing the subclavian vein, which is located beneath the clavicle and is responsible for draining blood from the upper limbs into the heart. This is a major vein, and when she was stabbed, blood would have forcefully spurted out, leaving the trail found across the mirror and dresser. Likely, it was presumed, the killer would have also been sprayed by her blood. According to Cardwell, the severity of the wound resulted in Janet bleeding out, collapsing in the bathroom after she tried to escape. Reportedly, the dozen or so stabs and slashes carried out by the killer were done while Janet was bleeding out and continued even after the fatal wound had stopped bleeding. Ultimately, Janet's cause of death was determined to have been exsanguination, or in layman's terms, she bled to death, and in total, it had taken less than 3 minutes. Cardwell explained, saying, quote, "There were numerous other blows that could have been fatal in due time, but it was the one knife wound that was fatal." Cardwell reported that outside of the stabs and slashes, he could find no wounds or signs of a struggle on the body and no indication of sexual assault. Based on the angle of penetration from the paring knife, confirmed to be the murder weapon, Cardwell notified investigators that the killer was likely shorter than Janet, who had stood 5 feet 9 inches tall. Determining the time of death was slightly tricky, though, with Cardwell noting that Janet had probably been killed anywhere from 20 to 28 hours before her body was found, placing the time of death somewhere between 7 p.m. Saturday evening and 4 a.m. Sunday morning. This estimation, though, may not have been entirely accurate, as investigators later noted that it was a hot, humid weekend and Janet's air conditioning had been running full blast. That, combined with the fact that she lay on the cold tile of the bathroom floor for hours before her discovery, could have thrown off the estimate, making it possible that Janet was killed even earlier, perhaps as early as 1 a.m. Saturday morning. Taking the cold air and floor into consideration, investigators believe Janet probably was killed early in the morning on Saturday. That would explain the fact that they could not find a single person who saw or spoke to the victim for the entirety of Saturday, and it would fit in with the witness who claimed to hear a scream and a car driving away around 3:30 that morning. To this date, more than 45 years later, the official time of death ranges from anywhere between 3 a.m. and 11 p.m. on Saturday the 24th. Howard County Detective Sergeant Lee Eckert was placed in charge of the investigation, and he certainly had his work cut out for him. On Tuesday the 27th, Eckert was asked about the status of the investigation, to which he replied that they were still interviewing people but had not yet identified a suspect or a motive, telling the Chronicle Tribune, quote, "There's just so much that we're trying to put together." Media attention on the murder and subsequent investigation spread across the state and into surrounding states, all of whom reported about the vicious nature of the murder as well as the apparent lack of clues and suspects. Howard County Sheriff Robert Sargent was very vocal about his desire to capture the killer as fast as possible, telling the Kokomo Tribune, quote, "What we're doing now is that long, slow process of separating the wheat from the chaff. It takes a lot of hours and a lot of time, but we'll get it done. I want that sucker in jail." Sheriff Sargent, and with a name like that, how could he be anything but a law enforcement officer, noted that 4 detectives were assigned full-time to the case and that the sheriff himself was also working it. He was very clear. The case needed to be solved quickly, and if needed, additional officers would be assigned. They were putting together what pieces of information they had and continuing to conduct interviews with neighbors, friends, family, and co-workers, looking for anything that might lead them to a possible suspect. According to the sheriff, while there were a lot of rumors floating around that Janet might have known her killer, they didn't have enough information to confirm or deny that. He explained, saying they had no information yet to show that the killer was, quote, "anybody that she knew or did not know. I assume nothing that I do not know. We've developed other leads from the people we've talked to. We're learning more, but the process is slow." Asked about potential evidence, Sheriff Sargent stated that while they did collect evidence for processing, they needed to wait on the results from the crime lab. When those results would come, he couldn't say with any certainty, but he noted that he expected the tests back within the next week. For the most part, they didn't have a lot of evidence to analyze, as they couldn't be too sure what, if anything, in the apartment had been touched by the killer outside of the knife and the victim herself. Back at the Center Meadow Apartments, multiple residents spoke with local media and stated their shock. Not about the crime itself, as they noted the apartment complex had a lot of issues with crime, but about the fact that no one seemed to hear the murder happening. They described the walls as paper thin, saying they could often hear music and television sounds coming from their neighbors. Maybe the timing of the murder, likely in the very early morning hours, led to a lot of people sleeping through it. Owners of the complex announced plans to install security lights in the front of the building where Janet's apartment had been. At the time of the murder, only small exterior lights mounted by the doorways were present. Over the course of the next few months, more than a dozen detectives would be assigned to the case, but there didn't appear to be any movement or developments. pleas for answers and assistance from the family fell upon deaf ears, while transparency regarding the investigation was itself non-existent. Janet's mother, Rose, began a letter-writing campaign focusing on local politicians and law enforcement agencies, both local and federal. The Kokomo Tribune, one of the biggest local papers, started publishing letters weekly and almost daily from concerned citizens and family members asking why no charges had been filed, no suspects named, no new information released. In the absence of solid, reliable information from officials, the void was filled by speculation and a series of rumors suggesting the killer as possibly being a jealous boyfriend or another tenant in the building. One rumor, which many people found grotesque, was the idea that perhaps one of Janet's own students could have been involved. There were also rumors about Janet's previous employer, Universal Steel, which at the time was under federal investigation by the FBI in relation to some allegations of financial mismanagement. At the end of the day, no one knew anything for sure, but that didn't slow the rumor mill down even one bit. In fact, it seemed to hasten the effect. However, there was one rumor that grew from a quiet whisper to a loud roar, and that one didn't focus on any of the aforementioned possibilities. As Janet's former co-worker Jan Hinkle commented, within a few weeks, quote, the questions changed from who were her boyfriends to who was the girl. The girl, as she's always been referred to, was someone that the Shirar family strongly felt was responsible for the murder, or at a minimum, who was in possession of information that might be vital to solving the case. So, who exactly was the girl? Well, more than 40 years later, her name has never been revealed, but the story revolving around her and why she was being looked at with such intense suspicion was hard to downplay, even for local law enforcement. According to multiple sources, including newspapers, friends of the victim, and even family members, Janet was not alone the night she was murdered. Instead, another woman was present in the apartment, this so-called girl, who has been referred to as everything from Janet's associate, to her friend, to a former roommate, to an ex-girlfriend. In the hours leading up to the murder, Janet spoke to her mother on the phone twice, but did not mention anyone else being there. Investigators and the family now believe this girl was in fact present when both calls came in. In addition, she was also apparently in the apartment when the final call from a friend came in around midnight of what transformed Friday into Saturday. Reportedly, this woman made statements to multiple people which placed her in the apartment Friday night. One of the people to whom she made such claims was Janet's stepfather, Alvin, who later told authorities that the woman confidently had informed him that she was, quote, the last one to see Janet alive. A strange claim to make since, according to the police, the last person to see Janet alive was the one who killed her. The bizarre nature of this story doesn't end there. In fact, it gets even stranger. Allegedly after the murder, this unidentified woman makes a phone call to another unidentified woman. Whether based on speculation or the result of actual fact-finding, it's been heavily implied that during this call, the so-called girl told her friend that she had been involved in the murder. Towards the end of June, nearly a month after the murder, a Howard County detective joined by an FBI agent went to speak to the recipient of that call. Despite claiming that she would hand over all relevant information if asked, the woman told the lawmen that, under the advice of her attorney, she would not be answering any questions about what was or was not said on that phone call. The woman partially cooperated, detailing the nature of the relationship between Janet and the girl, but she would go no further. Allegedly, after refusing to give up any pertinent information, the woman told law enforcement that, quote, she would come forward about additional conversations if she thought justice could be served. Seems a strange comment to make, being that she was one of the largest obstacles preventing justice from being served in the first place. Under Sheriff Sargent, a comprehensive report of the investigation was put together and ultimately delivered to then County Prosecutor Fred Osborne, who referred to it as, quote, the largest investigative report I've come across in years. That report, heavily bulwarked by Sheriff Sargent's confident statements of the investigation's expansiveness, was delivered to Osborne in August, 3 months after the murder. Yet, by November, 6 months had passed since Janet was killed, and there was no movement from the prosecutor's office. No arrests, no subpoenas, no impaneling of a grand jury. By late November, public outcry was growing, and when pressed about the matter, Sheriff Sargent excoriated Osborne in the press, noting that he didn't believe the prosecutor was all that interested in pursuing the case. Instead, he'd returned the report to the sheriff's office and requested more evidence. Sheriff Sargent, speaking to the Tribune, noted that Osborne felt they didn't have enough evidence to move forward, but he disagreed. Sargent believed Osborne should have called the grand jury and presented the evidence, allowing the people to decide if the report was thorough enough and the evidence sound enough. Asked about why this wasn't done, Sargent replied, quote, I think if Fred Osborne was totally committed to the case, he would have. I don't know why he doesn't. I've seen Fred Osborne totally committed to a case, and there's none better. If he's committed, we've got a good case. If he isn't, we don't. For his part, Osborne countered, arguing, quote, law enforcement authorities feel that they have a good suspect, but they do not have the evidence to convict at this point. Sargent would not be silenced, though, making it evidently clear to the public that, were it up to him, an arrest would have already been made. Sargent continued, saying if Osborne didn't want to go before the grand jury, he could have, at a minimum, sought a subpoena to question both the girl as well as the woman she allegedly made statements to over the phone about the murder. Sargent went on to note that in less than a year after the murder, the woman who had received that call had already moved more than 4 times, and law enforcement were having a difficult time keeping track of her ever-changing whereabouts. According to then Indiana state law, only the prosecutor's office had the legal authority to subpoena witnesses, quote, in matters of suspected illegal activity or criminal cases to appear for questioning. Law enforcement is barred from forcing a reluctant witness to answer questions during interrogation or before a grand jury. Unfortunately, as the case moved forward, it became more about political arguments and the outcomes of elections rather than justice for the victim or her family. Frustrated with the long line of issues, Sheriff Sargent resigned from the department and towards the end of the decade would later find himself successfully elected as the mayor of Kokomo, Indiana. Osborne remained the prosecutor and continued to defend his perspective on the case, maintaining that there was not enough evidence available for a conviction. He would later tell the Tribune, quote, in general, when a homicide occurs, rarely is it a total stranger. They've been talking to friends and acquaintances to get leads as to who's responsible, and it goes without saying at this point, if we thought we could prove beyond a reasonable doubt who's responsible, someone would be in court. The investigation could lead several possible directions. It's a tragedy, and it's a tragedy for her family, but we don't have the evidence to convict. If we did, it would be on file. You never know when the least little thing might give you a break, but in this case, it just hasn't happened yet. October of 1981 marked 17 months since the murder, and the case had only grown colder. Asked for an update, it was reported that while initially there had been a dozen detectives working the case, that number was drastically reduced 6 months after the crime. So, where did it stand in 1981? Well, Prosecutor Osborne explained, saying, quote, nobody is assigned to it full-time, but new Sheriff Earl Howard has an entire department available to it if an aspect warrants it. The investigation is continuing. Everyone who came in contact with her 6 months, either way, is a suspect. They interviewed everybody I could possibly think they should. This same month, Major Steve Rogers, who took over the direction of the investigation after Sargent's resignation, noted that they were reworking the case from a different angle, saying, quote, "We have a new plan of attack, a new thing we hope will work." Well, whatever that new plan of attack was, it wasn't yielding any new or measurable results, and the case continued growing cold. In March of 1982, 22 months after Janet was brutally murdered, prosecutor Fred Osborne finally, for the very first time, sat down for a face-to-face meeting with her mother and stepfather. Rose, who had become extremely outspoken about the lack of progress, argued that Osborne just didn't seem to care much about what happened to her daughter and was unwilling to risk hurting his numbers with an election approaching by taking on a case he didn't view as a slam dunk. After the meeting, her opinions hadn't changed, as she stated, quote, "I think that he is trying now, and I think it's the public pressure." That pressure, as it was, came from several different angles. Rose and the family had organized a massive letter-writing campaign which flooded the Tribune. Almost daily, the paper ran different letters, some from friends and family, some from total strangers, and still yet others from anonymous law enforcement officers, who argued fiercely that this case could be solved if only the prosecutor's office would put their full power into the investigation and support the officers on the street working to bring justice home. Two people who had written letters, former co-workers Jan Hinkle and Elaine Langford, found themselves the target of a frustrated and angry prosecutor. On Sunday, February 22, 1981, Langford was summoned to the prosecutor's office to discuss the letter she'd written to the paper, in which she mentioned one of the bloody handprints on the wall. Frightened by this summons, Langford asked Hinkle to accompany her, and together the two women went to the office, where they later stated Osborne screamed at them, belittled them, and did everything in his power to try and intimidate them into silence. According to Hinkle, when the women brought up evidence such as the bloody print, Osborne shouted at them that he had no knowledge of that evidence and that they, as teachers, obviously knew nothing about the law. Hinkle later told the Tribune, quote, "I was furious. He tried to put me down. He could have been more sympathetic and patient. He didn't have to remind me I don't know about the law. I knew that already. I didn't belittle him like he did me. I was scared of him. I'm scared of him now. I know he's politically powerful, and I'm just a peon school teacher. I wanted to help Osborne find Janet's murderer, but he didn't want our help. He seemed to be telling us that we were overreacting." Much of the letters and arguments made publicly were about Osborne's seeming disinterest to question the alleged witness or the girl whom many believe was Janet's killer. According to Hinkle, during their meeting, Osborne claimed he was already in the process of trying to find the witness to bring her in for official questioning, but Hinkle, as well as many others, wondered why he was doing that now, as opposed to a year earlier when Sheriff Sargent had stated that was the next most logical course of action. Rose and Alvin, as well as Hinkle and Langford, stated that, in separate meetings, they were both told by Osborne that there was a, quote, "weakness in the pathological end of the investigation." Reportedly, Osborne stated that there was a conflict between what investigators believed happened and the official established timeline of the murder as provided by the coroner's office. Reportedly, in an attempt to bridge that gap, Howard County authorities had reached out to an out-of-state expert for assistance, though nothing appears to have ever come from that either. Asked about the case and their opinions of the investigation, both Sheriff Howard and Major Rogers declined to comment, noting that it was ongoing and they didn't want to jeopardize any aspect of it. Simultaneously, on the other side of town, Prosecutor Osborne was very blunt, telling the Tribune that the investigative result was not strong and relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence. He went on to say that while police had, quote, "suspects, maybe even a prime suspect, we feel that at this point there is neither sufficient evidence to obtain probable cause for a warrant for anybody's arrest, much less to sustain the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt." When Osborne was asked once again about bringing in the so-called witness who had been called by the girl many believed to be the killer, Osborne expressed frustration, noting that there was nothing to gain from forcing her to testify before a grand jury, saying, quote, "If we cannot get her cooperation through head-to-head conversation or interrogation of her, the chance of her cooperating before a grand jury are about the same as if she knows anything. That doesn't mean the investigation won't go forward." Apparently, Prosecutor Osborne was unaware of the legal remedies available for a witness who refuses to cooperate with an investigation and defies a subpoena by refusing to answer questions in a grand jury hearing, but obviously he knows more about the law than anyone else. All of this continued to build in the lead up to the election for county prosecutor, and a new, younger attorney had risen up to challenge Osborne. Charles Myers, during speeches and at campaign events, railed against Osborne's inaction, and even brought in Jan Hinkle to speak about her experiences with Osborne and his apparent disinterest in solving the case. Myers ran on the platform that he would immediately bring the case and all available evidence before the grand jury should he win. And when he did, ousting Osborne, who had worn out his welcome with the people of Howard County, many of whom felt that he had betrayed them and Janet's family by being more worried about statistics and elections instead of victims and justice. In May of 1983, just a few months after being sworn in, Prosecutor Myers announced they were calling the grand jury to hear evidence. 3 months later, in August of 1983, Circuit Judge Robert Kinsey officially called the grand jury and scheduled the hearing for the morning of Thursday, September 8th. What happens at a grand jury, who testifies, and what exactly is said is strictly barred from public disclosure, so we can't say with any certainty what may or may not have been presented as evidence during this hearing. The only thing that we can say is that no indictments came out of it, the investigation was not advanced through this action, and following the hearing, most of the coverage of Janet's murder and the political circus around it began drying up and fading out. For the most part, the only mention of Janet's name in future articles and news reports comes about when questioning current law enforcement about the case or interviewing friends and family about the dispute between police, the prosecutor's office, and that alleged lack of evidence. It was later reported that the woman who had supposedly received the call from the killer was eventually ordered by a judge to give an official statement to law enforcement, but that it did very little to assist them, if it even helped at all. Major Rogers would later say, quote, "That witness didn't know what we thought she did, or she just didn't want to tell us anything." May of 1989 marked 9 years since Janet was viciously butchered in her one-bedroom apartment, and there wasn't so much as a charge filed or suspect named. Then Sheriff John D. Beatty wouldn't discuss the details of the case, noting only that it remained an unsolved homicide that his department was determined to close. Asked about the so-called girl and claims that she was the real killer, Beatty refused to comment, saying that several suspects had been considered and he did not want to go deeper into that discussion. Beatty added that they hadn't given up, saying, quote, "I think one of the things that concerns all of us is that it's a homicide. It's an open homicide, and we would like to solve that case and arrest the person who committed that homicide. We still bring that case up and do pursue it, and have pursued it within the last month and a half." Beatty, however, did state his support of former prosecutor Osborne, telling the Tribune that the lawyer was right when he said the evidence was not solid enough to support charges. Beatty, who had originally worked the case in the early days of the investigation, told the Tribune, quote, "I think we basically wanted to submit the case to him to look it over and see if he believed there was enough to pursue it any further. He sent it back to us, saying no, that it really did need more investigation." 5 years later, in 1994, 14 years after the murder, Rose was contacted by the Tribune and asked about the case and what had or hadn't changed. The mourning mother expressed frustration, noting that she was exhausted from fighting for her daughter against a system which seemed entirely disinterested in finding justice. To her, While the police had tried, and even local reporters had been helpful, the prosecutor's office was a lost cause. She explained, quote, "They had a woman suspect, but the prosecutor never charged her. He kept telling us that there wasn't enough evidence to charge her, but I think he should have at least tried. We talked to the prosecutor several times in the last couple of years, but he won't do anything. But the police and the newspaper reporter I talked to back then really did try to help me. I just hope someday they get her." Over the course of the next decade, Janet's name came up rarely. When it did, it was normally in response to questions about the female suspect and the lack of police action. Major Dave McKinney of the Sheriff's Department made an interesting comment in 2001, which seemed to suggest a closer connection between Janet and her alleged killer, when he stated, quote, "What we would like to do, if there is any way to do it, is to go back with DNA. But in the Shirar case, it would not help since the main suspect lived in the apartment. Her DNA would be all over the place." This is the first time anyone associated with law enforcement made any reference to the suspect actually living at Janet's apartment, and this sent off another firestorm of rumors, many of which opined about whether or not the killer may have been someone with whom Janet had had a romantic relationship. Unfortunately, that's pretty much where the case falls into the lull of a cold case file and begins fading from the conversation. Deputy Lieutenant Greg Hargrove asked about the case in 2007, 27 years after the murder, noted there had been little movement, telling the Tribune, quote, "We have heard very little about this case. The last tip we received was in 1999. The circle of possible suspects is pretty small. We need additional information. There is no physical evidence to connect that woman to the crime. There is a lot of speculation. Every once in a while, we keep track of people of interest and re-interview them." Sadly, this is where the case stands today. There's no movement, no major investigation, and apparently no one working hard to find justice for Janet Shirar. Instead, a woman that many people believe was the killer has only walked free, but hasn't ever even been named publicly. A friend, who she allegedly called and confessed details of the murder to, as well, has faced no hardships as a result of her hard efforts to protect her friend, who may or may not be a brutal killer who needlessly ended the life of a dedicated, loving, and caring special education teacher. As time rolled forward, the family never forgot, even as more recent tragedies would veil their hearts. On Friday, September 29th, 1994, Janet's stepfather Alvin passed away. 21 years later, on Saturday, August 15th, 2015, Rose passed away while in hospice care in Indianapolis. To her dying day, she pleaded that one day someone would be arrested and charged with her beloved daughter's murder, but she believed she was going to be reunited with Janet long before that ever happened. In one of her last interviews, she sadly commented, quote, "We kind of gave up on finding anything out, but I feel like it could have been solved." 2 years later, on Saturday, February 11th, 2017, Janet's biological father, Richard, passed away at Marion General Hospital following a difficult battle with COPD. He was 90 years old. A less vocal member of the family, Richard had been very close with Janet, and according to those who knew him, he never got over her murder and lost all faith in law enforcement as a result. 29-year-old Janet Rose Shirar was a loving and dedicated daughter, sister, aunt, and teacher. Her students meant the world to her, and she selflessly gave everything she had, sacrificing her own free time and social life to do everything in her power to provide them with the best, most compassionate and focused education that she could. Sometime between midnight on Saturday, May 26, 1980, and 11 p.m. Sunday, May 27th, she was viciously attacked with a 4-inch paring knife taken from her own kitchen drawer. Fleeing from the blade, she made it only so far as the bathroom before collapsing to the floor, where she ultimately bled out in less than 3 minutes. 45 years later, there are no answers, no solutions, and no one has been held accountable for this heinous act. Yet somewhere out there, a killer walks free, and someone with information that could finally break this case open continues to remain mute, allowing justice to be silenced and the spirit and memory of a beautiful, kind soul to continue to be denigrated. Asked about the status of the case, all these years later, Jan Hinkle simply replied, quote, "Janet was vivacious. She had more energy, loved those kids. She was effervescent in her life, and all at once someone took it away from her. We have a legal system that's supposed to punish, and it didn't do its job. Somebody prevented our judicial system from fulfilling their responsibility, and I don't think that's the way it should be. I don't care if it's 20 years from now, and I would hope no one would allow my murderer to go unpunished." When it comes to the murder of Janet Shirar, there's a whole lot of information that ultimately builds up to a lot of failure and inaction. Now, for their part, it appears very clear that law enforcement worked hard to try and bring about a resolution, but when the limitations of their evidence were discovered, they essentially hit the wall. It doesn't matter how thorough of an investigation you conduct if the prosecutor's office won't take it on. At the same time, no prosecutor wants to walk into a courtroom where they feel like the burden of proof hasn't been met and the evidence isn't strong enough to lead to a conviction. In some instances, that's a simple matter of not wanting to see killers acquitted before enough evidence can be found, and in a rush to give voices to justice, one might rob the prosecution and family of both. In others, however, we get inundated with buzzwords about political accountability, elections, optics, and a win-loss ratio. Sadly, in a case about the murder of a 29-year-old teacher, much of the discussion centered around almost everything but the victim herself. No evidence, circumstantial evidence, not enough evidence, not strong enough evidence. Depending who you ask, this was either a tight case with enough to make charges or so unsupported that even the idea of subpoenaing a potential witness was looked at like a foolish act. When those we look up to as figures of authority in law enforcement are contradicting one another and arguing about what is and is not enough for an arrest, it's difficult to accept that any sense of justice will be found. Countless times in previous episodes, we've seen exactly what happens when a case is at the center of a political debate. We either see a lot of resources poured into it, resulting in new developments, or it continues to be ignored, mentioned only when the name of the victim might score points, and then ignored again when the argument becomes moot. Unfortunately for Janet and her family, there was absolutely some politicization here. Now, which side you come down on depends on what you personally believe, and that's no way to make decisions about an investigation. Factual information, evidence, witness statements, and testimony are what should drive law enforcement, and that includes the prosecutor. On the one hand, while I agree with Sheriff Sargent that I would have liked to have seen the alleged witness called before the grand jury, as well as the suspect herself, we are forced to acknowledge that while Osborne may have come across as cold, smug, and uncaring, he ultimately proved to be right. A grand jury was called, testimony was compelled, and nothing came out of it. Whatever the jury members heard during their hearing clearly wasn't enough for them to support the issuance of any indictments. So, what actually happened here? Who was responsible, and why was Janet specifically targeted? Those are all questions we don't have the full answers to, and instead, we're left to depend on rumors and speculation, information gleaned from reading between the lines of interviews with law enforcement officials, and claims from friends and family who, above all else, want to see justice served. Unlike a lot of cases I've covered in the past, there isn't even a suspect named here. Instead, we're left to patch together what information we can, and ultimately it comes out like this. In the hours leading up to her murder, Janet was at her apartment at the Center Meadows complex, southeast of Kokomo. She was preparing for a busy weekend, which would include a family gathering as well as a birthday celebration. Friday night, she speaks to her mother on the phone twice to confirm plans that she got the cake and was picking up the present they'd agreed on. A few hours later, near midnight, an unidentified friend calls and speaks to Janet for an unspecified period of time. After that, no one knows for sure what exactly happened until the moment of the violent knife attack. According to Janet's stepfather, her mother, and her former co-worker, Jan Hinkle, this unidentified woman makes statements claiming that she is the last person to see Janet alive and that she was present in the apartment for both of the calls from Rose as well as the final call from the friend. It would appear, since Janet does not mention this woman's presence to anyone, that she was either keeping it secret that she was there or she didn't think it was worth mentioning. Things at some point go sideways, though. It's difficult to try and speculate as to the specifics, but based on the condition of Janet's body, nude and brutally stabbed when she's found by her friend and parents, we can surmise that at some point she went to bed. Her clothes are found neatly folded in her closet, suggesting she had removed them prior to laying down, but we can't know that with any certainty. At some point, the killer moves into the kitchen and pulls a 4-inch paring knife from the drawer. The killer then returns to the bedroom and attacks Janet, the first stab wound fatally severing the subclavian vein, resulting in a massive spurting of blood, which shoots across the dresser and mirror. According to the coroner, shoots across the killer as well. The lethal wound is gushing blood, and in desperation, Janet runs to the bathroom, but it's already too late. Moments later, the killer catches up with her and begins stabbing and slashing at her even as she expires. This, however, does not stop the killer, as many of the wounds were reportedly inflicted post-mortem. The attack, so brutal and vicious, is referred to as a hate killing long before the term hate crime was even part of the common parlance. In this instance, the statement isn't referring to the victim, the killer, or the murder, but is a commentary on the brutality which left seasoned detectives overwhelmed by the scene they stumbled upon. After killing Janet, the killer lingers in the apartment for an indeterminate amount of time. Based on the condition and positioning of the body, it appears the assailant posed Janet and took time to carefully wipe down her hands. Perhaps Janet fought back and had managed to get some of the killer's blood, saliva, or hair, and that had to be rectified. Based on the bloody handprints, it sounds as though they belong to the killer as well. One outside of the bedroom on the wall beside the door, another on a wall near the kitchen, noted as being approximately waist high and probably the result of accidental contact during the cleanup process. Of course, there are details about the apartment which go unexplained and for which the police have never offered up any speculation. Janet's purse is in the middle of the living room and has clearly been opened and gone through. The telephone and stand are moved from their normal spot as if someone either wanted to make a call without anyone in the bedroom or bathroom hearing it, or perhaps to make it more difficult for Janet to get to the phone to call for help once the attack had begun. We simply don't know. But when you factor in claims about the killer calling a female friend and confessing, or at least revealing vital details of the crime, one must confront the haunting possibility that, as Janet slept 50 feet away, the killer was on the phone discussing what she planned to do, or after having done it, what she had just done. Time and time again, when listening to forensic analysts and psychologists, we are told that knife crimes are personal, that they usually suggest a connection between victim and killer. Obviously, that's not always the case, but given that Janet appears to have let her killer into the apartment, and she was there during multiple phone calls, surely implies some kind of a connection between the two. One detail about the case which has always stuck with me comes from the statement made in 2007, that the one and only suspect had previously lived in the apartment with Janet. It's worth noting that this is a small, low-cost, one-bedroom, one-bathroom apartment. If you're letting someone move in with you under those circumstances, if you're not already close with them, you're about to become extremely close given the square footage and lack of space. No statements have ever been made about Janet's relationships. be they with men or women. But if we're looking at the possibility that the killer may have been a former girlfriend, or perhaps someone who wanted to be, that makes things very different. Was Janet killed because she wasn't interested in pursuing an intimate relationship or returning to a relationship that she had previously been in? It's difficult to say with any certainty one way or the other, but I also don't think it's something we can rule out. Some have suggested that perhaps Janet and this woman messed around a little bit, and while Janet didn't want anything serious, the other woman did. All of that is pure speculation, but in a case like this, speculation is almost all we've got. I've always wondered if Janet being nude that night was a choice she made, or if it's possible that she was forced to undress, perhaps at knife point. The autopsy report specified that no signs of sexual assault were found, but what if this wasn't in the way we normally imagine? What if instead of forcible penetration, what if she was forced at knife point to provide oral copulation to the victim or vice versa? What signs of sexual assault would be detectable under those circumstances, specifically noting that the killer wiped down parts of Janet's body after the crime? I sincerely doubt that an autopsy carried out in May of 1980 in Kokomo, Indiana would generally have been searching for what could be subtle signs of sexual assault that do not stand out as strongly as, say, bruising, bite marks, and tearing. Again, I'm no expert in this area, but I simply find it hard to believe that you can say with any certainty whether or not Janet may or may not have been subject to a sexual assault, especially if the acts may have been carried out under duress and at the point of a knife blade, but, like so much of this case, we simply don't have enough information to know. Then we get into this whole ridiculous conversation revolving around this other woman who the killer allegedly calls, and honestly, I don't even know. In some reports, it's heavily suggested she basically confesses to the murder. In others, we hear that she makes comments that put her at the crime scene leading up to the murder, but nothing more specific. She allegedly tells Alvin that she was the last person to see Janet alive, and while that sounds rather mild, however, she said it was enough to make Alvin believe there was something more sinister behind her words. Unfortunately, again, we don't know. And because this woman is never brought in for questioning or subject to a subpoena, we have no idea what she would or would not have had to say about the crime, what her alibi was, etc. It's reported that investigators focused on this woman for 16 months after the murder, but never got enough to file a charge. Short of a confession, I'm not sure what exactly they thought they were going to dig up on her, unless she had a bunch of other people she normally called to talk about murders she may or may not have been involved in. So you're left without enough evidence to charge her, and then, when it comes to the woman she apparently called, this lady has the audacity to refuse to reveal the contents of the discussion while arguing that if she thought justice could be served, she'd come forward. It sounds to me like a solid black and white case of protecting a murderer and nothing more or less. If you're aware that someone has committed a horrifying crime like this, and not only do you fail to come forward, but you outwardly refuse to cooperate with the investigation, you're worse than the cowardly assailant. You're allowing a monster to go free while guaranteeing that the victim and her family never receive justice. In my book, that makes you a monster as well. Unfortunately, that's kind of where we come to an end on this case. There's no forensics to discuss, no prints to match, no hairs recovered, and no DNA to analyze. Hell, as one investigator said, even if they had DNA, it wouldn't do much for them since the suspect had previously lived in that apartment. This is a case that is only going to be broken by someone coming forward and sharing what they know. That's one area that everyone agrees on. Someone out there has the information necessary to solve this case, to bring Janet's killer to justice, and to allow the family to finally accept this harsh reality and begin to grieve for their loss. They weren't just robbed of a sister, aunt, daughter, and friend. They were robbed of the ability to say goodbye, to confront their grief with the knowledge that at least Janet's killer was identified, tried, and jailed. Janet Rose Shirar was a brilliant, kind, caring, and compassionate woman who was driven, focused, and determined throughout her entire life. She never took the easy way, choosing always to follow the path that would provide the greatest reward, and to her, serving as a special education teacher was the pinnacle of a life lived in devotion to knowledge, learning, and taking care of others. She was stolen away from this world long before her time, and she has now been deceased for 45 years, nearly twice as long as she ever lived in her 29 short years. If alive today, Janet would be 74 years old, and who knows where life would have carried her. We will never get to know, and neither will she. This is a very solvable case, and it's undoubted that someone out there has information that could help advance the investigation. It's just a matter of whether or not they will ever come forward, because without new evidence, a reliable witness, or an outright confession, the murder of Janet Shirar will remain open, unsolved, and very cold. If you're looking for more information about the murder of Janet Shirar, there are several news archives available. Unfortunately, information on this case can be difficult to find. For this episode, the Kokomo Tribune was an invaluable asset, and they really did an amazing job covering this case in the years after the murder. If you have any information about the murder of Janet Shirar, please contact the Kokomo Police Department at 765-459-5101. You can also contact the Howard County Sheriff's Department at 765-456-2020. Finally, you can freely submit information anonymously to Crime Stoppers of Indiana at 1-800-222-TIPS. That's 1-800-222-8477. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at traceevpod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group. You can find all social media and contact links in the show notes. At this time, I'd like to take a moment to thank our amazing Patreon producers, without whom this show would not be possible. Ann M. Bertram, Brett Eady, Christine Greco, Crystal J., Dierthy, Denise Dingsdale, Deani Dyson, Jennifer Winkler, Justin Snyder, Kara Moreland, Leslie B., Lisa Hobson, Nick Mohar Schurz, Roberta Jansen, Stacy Finnegan, Tom Radford, and Whitney Welp. This concludes our look into the murder of Janet Shirar, a horrifying crime that is incredibly solvable if only someone will tell what they know. This was officially episode 250, a number I never imagined reaching when I began Trace Evidence. I wanted to give a very special thank you to all of you who have graciously supported the show over these years. Without all of you, there would be no Trace Evidence, and for that, I'm extremely grateful. I want to thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll join me next time for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.